Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the LEI'D Back Life podcast, where we are talking about how to love entrepreneurship and improve daily. Last week, we had Stacey Brown Randall on, who talked to us about the 3 steps to a referral generating life. Super cool conversation about how to really do fun things with cool people that can lead to generating referrals. With that being said, we were like, hey, we got to keep the North Carolina vibe going. So I've got Terrell Turner on with us this week. But also, one, Terrell's an awesome person. Husband, recreational hiker. We went rucking together. He's a 2-time global finance influencer, one of the top 22 CPAs to watch, a business owner, a public speaker, multiple speaking engagements, speaking on all sorts of things. So he has all the credentials, but 2, he's a genuinely cool guy, and I trust his opinion because it's not like the grind mentality. So when it came time to something that I know that I struggle with explaining to other people, that being money and finances from the standpoint of living a great life, I knew Terrell was the person that we had to have on to go into this. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Terrell, thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me, man.
So give everybody a little bit, fill in anything else from the bio, and then I want to dive into this because at the one hand, we've got an hour. On the other hand, we've got only an hour. So
So I'll say this, my background is accounting and finance. I will say accounting and finance probably saved or changed my life drastically because I'm one of those people when I was, younger in high school, I really went to high school just one is to keep my parents from, punishing me for not doing decent in school. And then plus I wanted to play on the football and the soccer team. And so I knew I had to do it, but I started taking accounting classes and business classes in high school. And for me, it was a whole new perspective because I was like, you know what, I actually like this. And so I decided to continue down that path from high school to college, and I've been working in it for years. And a lot of things that I learned along the way was that, you know what, I didn't really grow up in a household where finance was really talked about a lot. My father was, career military. He was a medic in the army and a paratrooper. So I knew a lot about, how to treat an injury. I knew a lot about the military life. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and because we moved a lot, she did a lot of babysitting. So I knew about, how to change a diaper very early on, or, how to potty train a child. So those are the types of things that I knew. Money wasn't one of them. And so it was just one of those things that became fascinating for me throughout life. And now, like I said, I lead an accounting firm. We work, with a lot of law firms and really helping them demystify and understand the money side of their decision-making process so they can make more confident decisions.
Well, and so here's the thing that I don't understand. You're sitting here, from your background, not having as good of an understanding of money coming from the home standpoint. But I think that's because we have this weird concept of believing that we're all going to hit the lottery or cash in some giant check and then have to figure out what to do with it. Instead, I love money for a number of reasons, but I love it from the standpoint of it's the easiest time where it's the easiest place where we use time as a variable. So that's why I wanted to take time out of the first part. And we are truly sitting here and saying, okay, if I invest X per month at this compound interest over this time, I'll have, $1 billion when all is said and done. But we need more people to be having that conversation instead of this weird, just hit the lottery, just sell your business for 8 figures, just have some crazy exit strategy on this one thing. It's wild to me that that's what so much of the conversation is about, when for 99% of people, it's going to be what your parents did. It's going to be the military income and pension. It's going to be, one spouse picking up some extra babysitting jobs to be able to afford whatever is needed extra on top, right?
I agree. I mean, and I think part of that became because the places where you did hear people talk about money, because like I said, I was one of those strange kids that it wasn't talked about, but it was something that was interesting for me. I started off really thinking about the subject matter of money in probably a very unconventional way, like watching DuckTales. Scrooge McDuck was my favorite character on the show. And he and I used to
Swimming in the
love
gold coins.
absolutely. And I will say, but the funny thing is, what stood out to me was there was one episode early on where he's sitting and reading the newspaper and he's talking about tax deductions and he's arguing about his friend who is gonna, or this his enemy who is going to build a rival building. And he had a very quick comment about the business side of it, and for some reason that stood out to me. And so from as far back as I think, the people that I heard talk about money were people who were really, really rich, or if you happen to come across like the finance channel on television where they're talking about stocks and bonds. And I think so many people don't talk about it because all they've ever really heard about money is from people who are either really, really rich and they can't participate in those conversations, or they hear it from people talking about stocks, bonds, and investing. And a lot of that is way more complicated than it needs to be. But I don't think you hear enough people, as you were saying, talking about it from a practical, livable standpoint on like, okay, all right, what do you do if you want to have a better financial future? And not the complicated of, hey, we need to go do some option trading or we need to do stocks and stuff like that. Because for most people, that's not really what they can wrap their mind around. But I think it wasn't until after I became an adult, maybe in like my early 20s, that I would occasionally come across a book where someone was talking about it in a practical sense of like, investing, putting money aside in your 401k or saving X amount a week, and then it starts to compound over time. Because to be honest, even though I was into finance and accounting, you really didn't learn about compound interest until like your sophomore, junior year of college. And I'm like, that's only because I was a business major. Now, everybody else at the university, they didn't have to take that class, so they didn't really know about it. And I think that it is a disservice that finance people have done to society of us not having those conversations in a very practical and just casual way.
I'm trying really hard to get over the fact that your first foray into finance is an animated duck. Like it's so perfect in so many levels. Well, and to your point about like learning about compound interest in high school because you're a finance major, the beauty of compound interest is the sooner you start on it, the better it is. So like if you taught it to kids at 8 and then like the lemonade stand got invested in an S&P 500 index fund at average return over whatever time frame, like it's worth so much more than waiting until somebody's, I don't know, 35 and has a child and now is like, wait, I'm never going to be able to stop working because I can't afford anything. Like you've missed out on so much so much savings potential.
Absolutely. And I think I mean the whole concept of compound interest, it I think we treat it as if it is something super complicated, and there is a very complex like kind of mathematical side to it. But I think the simplest way to look at it is, a if you start saving, $1 today, over time it's going to earn more interest as opposed to waiting 10 years from now to start saving $1. And it's just like that interest that it earns over time just continues to add up more and more and more the sooner you start. And I think if we really focused on it from that basic standpoint, it would make so much more sense to people. And I think that sometimes people think that you got to have a ton of money, or you can't start saving until you have these large chunks of money. And to be honest, it's better for you to save $1 a day, and starting really early than for you to waiting until you get this huge check and then you're going to put that check in there, because I'm like, that check isn't going to create as much interest as opposed to starting at just $1 a day or $1 a week. Or because what I find is people who do start early and start saving or putting a little bit aside, over time, the amount that you're able to put aside ends up growing if you develop the discipline of doing it consistently. And then plus all the compound interest kicks in and stuff like that, to where I think if we took a less scary approach to the subject matter, I think it would probably make more sense to people and more people would participate.
See, I have the opposite take on the first. I totally agree with you on the second part of what you said. for me, like loss aversion. So any of the research into humans talks about how we hate losing money at least twice as much as we like winning money. So if we had a coin flip and if you won it, you got $100, and if you lost it, you lost $100. You don't want to do that. It needs to be like 200 to zero or something like that. It's the same thing with money. Like if I hold on to this dollar bill and do nothing with it, it's worth 97 cents next year. It's worth 94 cents, whatever inflation becomes, as opposed to investing it at 8%. Now it's a buck eight, which is worth, a buck five or, whatever over time. Like I think that's what we need to push people more. Like if you are hanging on to money and not making it work for you, you're throwing a chunk of it out the window for nothing, for no risk, for no gain, for no reward.
Yeah, I think that that is, I mean, for the people who understand like opportunity cost, I think that really does make sense for them. And I think that's a concept that I think people do kind of struggle with is the, I guess it's almost like the opportunity cost is where, hey, you missed out on the opportunity to gain. When I've talked to some people, the way they've kind of, if they didn't really have a good concept of what opportunity cost is, they're like, well, I never really had the money in the first place, so it didn't really feel as painful. But I think you're absolutely right. Missing out on the opportunity to, take advantage of this is a big thing because, like you said, I mean, if your money isn't working for you, and let's say it's just sitting in your piggy bank at home, to use an older school example, your money just sitting in that piggy bank every year, that money becomes worth less and less and less because inflation is growing. Whereas if you just put it in something simple that gain, let's say a 4 or 5% interest rate, like that $1 is actually going to continue growing on its own over time. And I think most people who don't understand, like, hey, if you don't put this in the bank, it's going to gradually be worth less and less. And when I've had that conversation with people, they're like, well, it's still a dollar, but a dollar doesn't get you the same thing today that it did yesterday. And I find that for some people, that concept is a little challenging for them to wrap their mind around. But I think technically, yeah, you are absolutely right. That loss of opportunity is a huge thing. And I think more people are starting to recognize that. I would say in the past couple years, with inflation being growing as high as it has, where most people are starting to realize, like, man, the same amount of groceries I buy today compared to 2 years ago, like I'm getting a lot less. And I think now it's really starting to set in for people about this, the missed opportunity. It's just like, hey, the same $100 worth of groceries you spent 2 years ago won't get you the same thing today. Like, that's what it means. Your money is actually worth less today. So you got to put it in something that's going to actually allow your money to grow as time progresses.
So I think there's really two parts to this conversation, though, right? I think there's the getting in a financial position to have a surplus, and then what do you do with the surplus? Are you with me on that?
Yep. Yep. I totally agree.
Okay. So for the people listening to this that are living part of their life on a credit card as much as any other income, like what are the first steps that somebody should take to get in the position to have a surplus to be able to put towards living their best life in an affordable
Yeah.
way?
Yeah, I think the first thing I always tell people, and the first thing that I do myself, like as I go through different phases of life, because your numbers are going to change depending on what your life looks like. Like my number was very different when I was in college to when I graduated, and very different after I got married. And so I think, if whatever the phase of life you're in right now, I think the first thing is figuring out, like, how much does it actually cost to operate, the essentials in your life, like the things that you have to spend money on. And surprisingly, when I talk to a lot of people, like a lot of people don't know what that number is. Like if you ask them, like, how much money do you need to really cover, like, your basic essentials in life? And they're like, oh, I think it's such and such. And usually the average person will tell you a number that is much bigger than what reality is. They're like, oh, I need like $10,000. Okay, let's walk through the math, and it's like, oh, your essentials are really only like 5 grand. Like that's a very big difference between those two numbers. And I think the first thing I would tell people is just really sit down, do the math. Like, what does it really cost to, cover the essentials in your life? Because I think if you can start by understanding that number, then it's going to make it a lot easier for you to figure out like how to solve for the other parts of the equation. Because I mean, I think it's kind of like solving a math equation. Like I know not a lot of people love algebra. Like that was like one of my favorite, it was one of my favorite classes in school growing up because it combined, math with, solving a puzzle. And I think it's very hard for you to solve the money, question in your life if you don't know what the variables are. And the first variable has to be is how much money do I actually need? And then we can move on to the next steps.
Well, and the other thing is looking at what that number is going to be over time as well. Because like if you have a mortgage, how much more do you have left on the mortgage? And then what's you're still going to have property tax, you're still going to maybe have home insurance costs. Like what is that number going to go to? You pay off your car, you're still going to have fuel, you're still going to have maintenance of the vehicle, but you might be down the $500 a month car payment or whatever it is. So like not just knowing what you need, but knowing how much more is left on some of those things, I think becomes key too.
Yeah, and I would say I tend to put that in kind of step number two is like once we
Okay.
figure out okay how much you need for today, and then when we start looking okay all right when we want to start building a strategy okay all right we look over time like we figured out how much you need today all right based on the decisions and what's going on in your life like how much are you going to need over time because as you said like you know one of the things I enjoyed and really appreciated from my father like the first time we bought a car for me in high school to where I was like, hey, I really want this red sports car. And my father didn't say no. He said, okay. Well, what are we gonna do about insurance? Like, what do you think insurance is gonna be for a 16-year-old driving a red sports car versus driving this other car? And I was like, well, I don't know. He was like, well, you probably should think through that. And he was like, well, what about how much is it going to cost to, put gas in this car versus that car? And I was like, I don't know. It's like, well, you got some homework to do, buddy. And so I started going through it aware because at the time I knew what my expenses were, before I bought the car. Cause I'm like, hey, here's how much money I need to live. And he was like, well, based on the decision that you are about to make, what are your numbers going to look like after you make that decision? And I think that's where you start to look forward and say, like, for example, someone who's in a home, okay, what is your payments today? Okay. Well, what about the maintenance you're going to need on your home? Because at some point you may have to replace your air condition, or at some point you may have to do some repairs on your home, or at some point this is going to come up, and property taxes are going to become due. And you know what? In some places, property taxes don't stay the same every single year. And so I think that's where in step two, you start looking at, okay, we know where we are today. Now, based on the things that we can kind of predict, what is that essential number going to look like over time? And I think as you start to look at what that looks like over time, then I think the third step is, okay, we know where you are today. We have an idea of what your essential number is going to look like over time. Now, the third step, how much money are you making today? And how does that number compare to what you actually need? And when you really look at it for a lot of people, when they do kind of that simple three step, when they do the math of how much money am I making? How much money do I need? For a lot of people, they actually have more than what they need. The problem comes in is they're either spending money on things that they don't necessarily need right now, and they just didn't think through it to where, that's where they get into using the credit card to try to cover some of their essentials because they spent more than they probably should have on like leisure things and stuff like that. And I am not one to say, hey, you should live your life and only spend on the essentials. Because I will say is I've tried living like that. That's a tough life to live. But I think once you get a good perspective on, all right, we're gonna cover the essentials first. And then I think that's where you can start getting into strategies on like, what can I do creatively, either to cut cut back on some of my essential expenses. Maybe I don't need to live in as big of a house, or maybe I don't need to, buy, as expensive of a vehicle. Maybe I can try to adjust some things to really get the numbers in a place where I can feel a lot more comfortable.
Well, and even just like getting a new iPhone every 2 years or every 3 years instead of every 1 year or every 2 years at, 1,500 bucks a pop with all the new with the phone and whatever else you add to it. Like that adds up, if you can do that similar decision across a couple other things, like that changes the numbers drastically.
Absolutely. And it's small things like that that add up because often like I'll meet with a lawyer, and every now and then like some lawyers will say like, hey, I want to make more money, and I have to understand, all right, is this a business question or is this a personal finance question? Because sometimes the two get mixed in, and to where I'm like, well, if this is a personal finance question, let's look at where the money is going. Let's figure out like how much you need for, your basic living. And well, if this is a business question, let's figure out what does the business need to operate. And then so we kind of understand the basis. But one of the things that I find with a lot of people, especially now in the age of massive levels of subscriptions, a lot of people are subscribed to stuff that they don't even use anymore or something that they forgot about. Like, did you know you have four Hulu accounts? And they're like, well, why am I paying for so many? I don't know. I mean, do you have any Airbnbs or like rental properties you're paying for, or just, well, I signed up for this and I forgot about this. Well, how about this? What if we cut it down to just one? Or like, hey, did you know you're still paying for, this subscription service, or did you know you're still paying for this? They were like, well, I didn't know that that was that expensive, or I didn't know that they increased the price so much because when I started, it was only $7 a month.
Right.
Now it's $25 a month. And I'm like, yeah, well, let's figure out what we can do here. Or even when it comes down to, really shopping around for like bigger expenses. Like I tell some people when it comes down to like your insurance, like the insurance policy you have on your home, like do you know how much that is? And I would say is it's not a bad thing to pick up the phone, call another insurance company, tell them what you're paying, tell them your coverage today, and ask them if they can beat it. Because you might be able to save a good amount of money by just comparing and looking at other options as opposed to just kind of going with the flow of what you've been doing in the past.
Well, and it's interesting you mention the streaming services because like there's this weird benefit. So we cut cable, we got Netflix. Now we added, whatever else there is, Hulu and Paramount Plus and Peacock and Disney Plus and whatever. So like you're spending more money than you would have on cable to have access to everything in 27 different channels. And it's so overwhelming to find anything. So like we did all of July up in North Carolina, and I think Peacock and Netflix were the only two that we logged in on because we could travel with them after whatever a certain number of weeks. So we got locked out of some of the other ones. We weren't home. It was actually better because instead of being like, here's 97 places to check, every movie in the history of human time, it was like, okay, here's, on like my IMDb page, here's like the 15 movies that I want to watch that are on Peacock. Great. I can just go down the list. Like there isn't, the Barry Schwartz talks about the paradox of choice, which I wish I could tell you we canceled all the other ones and just stuck with a couple of them. We have all of them and they're logged in now. But for that month, it was liberating to have so few services because I was actually able to watch movies I had not watched, had been wanting to watch for 4 years, but got caught up on the new whatever else that just came out or the new TV show or I don't know, whatever else gets in our way on things.
Absolutely. And I think that, I've fallen into that before as well. Of like, you subscribe to all these different things. Like, I can't remember like I think when my wife and I moved into this house we have now in North Carolina, like that was the first time like I remember paying for cable. Probably in like maybe 12 years. And part of that is because we had the different subscription services now. The reason why we ended up paying for it is because it was a package deal that came with the level of internet speed that we wanted because I do a lot of streaming and video stuff like that to where I'm like I needed a higher internet speed. And so it came included with it. And it was something that dawned on me about like there were different packages that you could get because even when I got my new cell phone and they were telling me, and I had a old, like one of the original, like unlimited data plans to where they were like, hey, we've been running these new promotions. Like you can get Hulu, Disney, and ESPN. And it was actually cheaper to get that promotional plan than it was to pay for those things separately. So I went back and I said, okay, all right, well, I'm going to cancel all my individual subscriptions and then just buy it through this bundle and save a bit more money. And I think that more companies and more opportunities exist out there for people to like get certain bundles as opposed to paying for, like I said, all these incremental pieces because before, like I said, if you were just going to cut cable and say, hey, we're only going to have Netflix, it makes sense. But most people, when they end up cutting cable, they end up buying the same stuff just in like 15 different pieces. And I'm like, when you look at the numbers, you realize like you're paying more for those 15 different pieces than you were just for cable. And you've now introduced yourself into this chaos of now you got to go to 15 different places to see all your options. You end up spending way more time like surfing through the app as opposed to actually watching anything. To where I think that if you can really start to find ways to just rethink simple things like that. I mean, simple subscriptions and even when it comes down to like on Amazon where like there's stuff that you buy that you have delivered and stuff like that because my wife and I were looking at that like she bought this food service program, whatever, where they were delivering food. And I went in the refrigerator once and I'm like, our entire refrigerator is all of these food things. I'm like, are you eating this stuff? Because I'm like, there's no room for me to put anything else in here. And I think it was where it dawned on her. She was like, you know what? I probably should rethink this subscription plan because we're not actually utilizing it and she did. She stopped doing it and we switched and stuff like that. But I think that there are a lot of people who will find opportunity in being able to create more, I guess you say more breathing room in their budget if they really looked at what am I spending money on that's not essential? Like what can we actually cut out of the picture?
Um, Before we transition to once you have a surplus, what to do with it, anything else about the getting to the point where you have a surplus?
Yeah, I would tell a lot of people. I think sometimes people avoid doing this first part of it because I think they're either embarrassed that they don't have a surplus or they're afraid of what the numbers are going to tell them or, they're going to beat themselves up about, we should have never bought this house and I always tell people is that clarity is so much better than just sitting in the unknown is where I think it is very helpful for you. Like, yes, you may find some stuff that you don't like, or you may realize that, hey, you made some bad decisions in the past. But in order for you to really make the situation better, we do have to start off with some level of awareness. And so I always tell people is, don't beat yourself up when you find out that, hey, you made a bad decision in the past, or don't avoid going through the process of uncovering it because we all have made bad financial decisions at some point. I mean, the best thing we can do now is identify it and then adjust and make changes to actually make the future better than it is today. And also that you may find that, when you run through your numbers, maybe you don't have a surplus. And I think that's a great opportunity for you to figure out like maybe we can come up with a strategy to create a surplus. And maybe that surplus starts off really small and then it grows over time as you become better at what you do or you become more thoughtful about how you're approaching money. So I would say that's the last thing I would say of like kind of step one of figuring out like how to manage, where you are today before we get to a surplus.
Um, and You phrased it as financial mistakes. I call them expensive lessons I've learned. But no, yeah, and I think the other thing that I want to highlight, you touched on this, but I want to highlight it. You can find a surplus by cutting back. You can find a surplus by making more money. And I don't care, or both, really. I mean, it's probably a blended program on both sides, but like, don't. don't force yourself into one of those buckets or only one of those buckets or, whatever else. Because both of those things will work towards the surplus is spending less or making more.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think to that, I mean, there's only so much you can cut because depending on what your numbers look like, I mean, unless you have some very outrageous leisure spending, there's only so much you can cut. And what many people do realize is like, hey, I need to figure out a way to grow the income, in which I think it becomes a lot easier for you to figure out how to grow your income when you have clarity about the target you're aiming for. Like when you know, like, hey, I need to increase my income by $1,000 a month, is a lot easier to come up with a plan for that as opposed to saying, hey, I need to make more money. Like it's going to be very hard for you to kind of come up with a strategy because you haven't given yourself enough clarity to know what exactly am I aiming for.
Love it. All right. So I want to talk about this week's newsletter, and then we're going to come back to go into that. This week's newsletter is the 4 ways to accomplish more with fewer people. Broke it down in the fact there's really only 9 ways to change how things get done at your business. So last week we talked about the 5 that don't involve people in the newsletter. This week we're talking about the 4 that do. Super excited to get that out to you all Fridays at 3 o'clock, totally free. You can sign up at jordanostroff.com if you're not currently getting them. All right, so jumping back with Terrell. So now that you have a surplus, we have gone through the 3 steps to get to the point where there is a surplus. How do we figure out what to do with that surplus?
Absolutely. So I think when it comes down to you've identified that, hey, we have a surplus. I mean, the dollar amount is going to play a big role. Like if you have a $1 surplus versus you have a, $5,000 surplus, like the dollar amount does play a role in your strategy. So I think once we figure out what it is, if it's a smaller dollar amount, maybe the surplus starts off of like, hey, we're going to put this in a interest bearing account because like, hey, we can put the money there. It can grow over time until it gets to a certain amount where we can make a larger investment decision. So if it's a small amount of money, I would say your easiest bet is put it in something that gains interest and just to, continually put it there until it grows till you saved up enough to make a more substantial decision. Now, if you have, let's say, a couple $1,000 extra, then you can start looking at more strategic decisions, whether, like I said, you invest in something that has a higher potential of growth, whether that's you invest in stocks or whether you invest in like bonds. You have more flexibility. The bigger the number is, the more flexibility that you have. And I think the key is, really is finding something that you can do consistently over time. Because I think whether it's a small number or whether it's a few $1,000s, it's really about what can we consistently do over time. And some people are, if you're at a point where you're like, Terrell, I don't think that the savings are gonna really produce any, like if interest rates are like close to 0%, maybe one of the beneficial things could be like, hey, if you have a mortgage, maybe we put a little extra towards the mortgage because what that's going to do is it's going to allow you to pay less interest and expenses over time because as you get older, one of the benefits of not having debt is that hey, your monthly expenses will go down over time. And I know for my wife and I, that was one of the things that we looked at is when we got married, we wanted to pay off whatever debt we had because we didn't have a ton of money, but hey, we could put a few extra dollars towards, the car payment or a few extra dollars towards the credit card to get that balance, to get rid of that balance. And like within 11 months, we were able to, pay off the car, we paid off the credit cards to where it's like we were in a much more, I guess you would say, peaceful state when it came to finances because we didn't have the debt kind of hanging over us and we didn't have like a huge amount of excess money, but we were a lot more comfortable. And I will say is for anyone who is married, especially if you're in the earlier years, lowering the financial burden on your life is probably a huge help to your marriage because you got a lot of stuff you're trying to figure out as far as like combining your life or, I guess you say cooperating your life with another human being. Like being able to lower the financial pressure is a very can be a very huge help. Because I think it allows you to then switch your mind to focus on other things that are beneficial. So I would say kind of starting off those three options is if you don't have a lot of money, let's say if it's less than $1,000, is either look at, hey, how do we put a little extra towards paying off our debt faster? Or finding an interest bearing account that you can continually and consistently put money in to let it grow over time. Now, if you got a couple of $1,000s extra, maybe you can look at things that have a higher kind of return on investment, like looking at stocks or something like that, or looking at bonds, things that are going to grow a bit faster than your average savings account.
So along those lines, is there, I guess, best practice, industry standard? I don't know. Is there like a, X amount of money or X number of months of money in something that is safer, this in stuff that's more volatile? Like, is there a way to do that? Or is that really an individual, like you need to figure out your own risk tolerance and figure it out from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an individual thing. A baseline I usually tell people is that, start with 2 months worth of your living expenses and set aside in an account to where, hey, if something happened, you at least got 60 days to figure it out. Like if the bottom fell out of everything, give yourself at least 60 days to kind of figure out what your next step is. Because within that 60 days, you're probably going to come up with a plan. And so I usually recommend for people is how do we get to the point where we set aside at least 2 months of your living expenses to the side? Because that's going to give you that peace of mind that you have somewhat of a trampoline that you can use. Like if the bottom falls out, hey, it's not going to hit the ground and crash. You got some kind of net there or trampoline to kind of help, give you a boost until you get back on your feet. And which, I would say is very important because I've been through that where, like I said, when I started my career, I was like, hey, this is gonna be great. Setting aside money. What I didn't know is like 2.5 years in, the bottom was gonna fall out the market, and I got laid off from my first job. And I'm like, well, glad I had that savings there. And even at the time, like when the bottom fell out the market, like, there were people in my family who were more hurt than me. And because I had a little bit of a savings there, I could sustain myself. Plus, I could be a blessing to other family members who were in a worse situation. I'm like, had I not set money aside or at least had that kind of 60-day cushion, I probably wouldn't have been able to help myself nor help other people in my family. So I usually tell people is I would start with aiming for a 60-day cushion. And after you get that 60-day cushion, like you may have a preference of wanting more. Like, for example, like when I left my job, my full-time job to start my business, my wife and I had a conversation and she was like, you know what? I would feel more comfortable if there was, X amount in the bank. And it ended up being somewhere around like 4 months worth of expenses. So I was like, I can't leave my job until we have 4 months worth of expenses because that was the preference that she had. And I was cool with it. And so I think, everybody's going to be different, but I usually recommend try to give yourself like a 60-day cushion.
But see, I love, like, you had it as a throwaway line. I love it. Like, I can't leave my job and I can't do X until Y from a financial standpoint. So for me, you like gamify it. So no joke. I told myself, I don't know, whatever it was, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, I was like, hey, when I fill my coaching spots and I'm making X every month from that, I'm gonna go back to letting myself get a massage every week. And like that was my game. Cause like I don't need a massage every week, but I want one. And so, like, but little things like that, it gives you something to look forward to. It's an easy celebration when you hit the goal. It's something that you can work towards and it gives you focus. So you knew like the sooner that we could save 4 months, the sooner I could start my firm. For me, I knew the sooner I, resolved all the coaching stuff, the sooner I could get my weekly massage. And it's been great.
Absolutely. And I think that, that clarity around, making certain decisions like that becomes a very, very, very helpful, because I think so many people tend to struggle is because they don't really have, that type of clarity of like, hey, once I achieve X, then I can enjoy this, or once I achieve X, then this could happen. And most people are just like, I would like to get a massage every week. And it's like, it's not really tied to anything. So it's just like, well, how are you going to know when you get to the point where you can actually make that decision? Because what you don't want is, well, I feel like we have enough money for me to get a massage every week. So I'm just going to go ahead and get it. And then on the back end, the guilt kicks in the first time an issue pops up. But when you say, like, hey, once I get all my coaching spots filled, I can go back to it. No matter what happens, like, you've achieved the goal, and it gives you clarity on the back end. Like, you probably can enjoy the massages guilt free because you're like, I did the thing that we set out for. And I think a lot of people, when it comes down to their finances, even people who do have a surplus, I think when they're trying to do things that they enjoy, like, for example, my wife and I wanted, well, my wife more than me wanted to travel. Like, I don't mind traveling. I enjoy traveling, but she likes it more than I do. And so she wanted to get to a point where we do at least one international trip a year. And I think the first year we did it, we didn't really have clarity around it. And we did the trip. And to be honest, we didn't really enjoy it as much, because part of it, you're thinking throughout the trip, man, we could have spent the money on this, or we could have used the money to do this. And I was just like, this is a bad way to do it. Like, let's just set some clarity. Like, hey, what we started to do is we set up a travel fund, and we're going to save X amount per, paycheck. And then whatever money is in there, you can spend it on whatever you want. And so we just set aside money, and I'm like, hey, you've already have your budget for the trip. You can spend all of the money and we won't have an issue. And I will say, after we started doing that, she enjoyed the trips, and I enjoyed the trips a lot more because we were operating within a clearer game plan.
Totally. And so this huge disclaimer, Jordan Ostroff 2 cents on money. So like I try to do, 50%, live off 50%. Like that is mortgage, that is car payments, that is food, that is that stuff. And then with the other 50%, it's like 20% for investments. Normally it's like 10% longer term, 10% like crazy stuff. Like you want a short GameStop, go for it. Like that would be, that 10%. 10% on investing in you. So coaches, conferences, that kind of stuff, 10% for charity, and then like a 10% buffer, which ends up being, fun. Also, although I consider travel like the 10% for me on some of the stuff. So that was how I negotiated with myself, my massage in my 10% go nuts with part of it, as the extra coaching clients would make up the difference for that. So
And I think, having targets like that help out a lot, because my wife and I, when we were early in our marriage, one of the things that we knew, like, all right, we wanted to give to charity and churches. And so when we went through, we built that out in our plan. At the time, we were just like, we would love to give, 15% of our income to it. At the time, based on the numbers, we just weren't there yet. So we were like, hey, well, we'll set it. The goal was at 12%. And then we looked at it and we said, okay, all right, for leisure and travel, what percentage we want to give, set aside for that. And then we looked at our personal expenses. And the first thing we did is we set a goal on, okay, how could we get our life to the point where, you know, our living expenses, that we only needed 70% of one person's income, because both of us were working at the time. We were like, how do we get our like essential lifestyle down to less than 70% of one person's income? And it seemed extreme at the time. And like I said, we were nowhere close to that at the time when we were talking about that. But I think the fact that we set it as a goal, within 3 years, we had gotten to that point to where, our living expenses were under 70% of one of our income, to where it gave us so much more leeway to where now, like, hey, we could give more to charities and churches. we can be a bigger blessing to our family. I mean, we have like my wife is from Africa, and what we know is like, hey, the social safety nets in some African countries are not as strong as they are here in the US, or they don't even exist in some countries. So we're like, hey, how do we start to position our finances so that we can be a bigger blessing to family members who live in those regions where, hey, the economy is just going haywire? And those are the type of conversations we had early on to say, how do you plan for it? And then we talked about like, hey, I wanted to invest in whether it was buying real estate or different business ideas. So we set a number and we said, hey, I want us to be able to set aside $50,000 so that if a good business idea comes up, I don't feel like I have to rob all these other interests that we have to do it. Now, it took us years to get that $50,000 set aside, but it was something that we set a target for because I think sometimes where people do start, when they do have some surplus, I think that guilt of doing the things you want to do with the money because you haven't set up proper percentages or boundaries. And I think that becomes a helpful exercise for people to say, okay, what percentage of your income do you want to go to this? What percentage do you want to go to that? What percentage do you want to go to that? And you may realize that, hey, we aren't there yet. So then it's coming up with a plan to help you bring your life in line with these percentages because when you start doing that, I think you can live in a much more guilt-free way. And I think people tend to enjoy life a little bit more when you know that, hey, there's a plan for our money and we're actually working the plan as opposed to, hey, we're just kind of going by the flow.
Well, and as we get towards the end, like I want to highlight that point so much because this is not like save every dime you can. This is make sure you have enough money in place to afford your current living with 2 months, 4 months, whatever it is in reserve. And then like you can't take it with you at the end. So I'm not telling you to blow every dime, but like I don't want to be sitting here in 30 years going like, "Oh man, I wish I had taken that trip when I could physically do it. I wish I had gone and done this when I could really enjoy it. I wish I had invested in this while I still could." Like the whole point of this, I think, is to get that buffer to know you're on the right path, to be able to take vacation guilt free, to get that massage every week, to buy that rental property. Like it's having the plan in place to let you do those things without the guilt of where else the money could go because you're taken care of if the proverbial S hit the fan.
Absolutely. And I think that, it really does come back to like, you got to do a little bit of math homework of figuring out what your baseline number is. Like, what do you actually need for your life? And then you can, like I said, kind of compare and look at, hey, are you on the verge of making any major decisions that's going to change that? Like when we decided to move to North Carolina, like we knew the type of house that we wanted to move into is like, hey, it's going to be more than the house we had in Ohio. So we had to figure out like, all right, what is our new number going to look like based on the decisions we were going to make? And then we looked at, hey, what is our income level and figured out like, hey, there still will be a surplus. And then I think it's just really creating a plan. What are we going to do with that surplus? And then I think really splitting it up to where it wasn't, hey, we're going to save 100% because neither my wife nor I were interested in that plan because we're just like, nah, we need to have some money for like for fun or just do whatever money. And I think once we kind of set up our percentages of like, hey, let's get 60 days in the bank for just in case anything happens. And then we want to save 10% we want to put into, hey, this is interest bearing, like this is money we're setting aside to let it grow. And of course, if we get like a bonus or if things turn out to be better than what we planned for, like we can put a little bit extra there. But as long as we're doing the baseline 10%, hey, we're in line with our plan. Now, the other money is like, hey, you can go do whatever you want to do. You want to go shopping, we want to take more international trips. That's fine. If we want to, spend a little bit more, get better seats at a concert, like we can do all those things, I think, because we went through that process of setting up a plan and really being thoughtful about the numbers. And I think when you do that, you can enjoy the money you're making because you're going to work really hard to get the money, or you're going to have to work really hard to build a business that creates the money. You probably should be doing something to enjoy it. If not, then I'm not sure you're going to have the best long-term relationship with money or the wealth that you build.
I love it. It's such a good, like, it's simple but not easy. I mean, it's just having this plan, honoring the plan, following the plan, tweaking the plan, like, and the more that we do these episodes, for everybody who's listened to a lot of them, like, this is what we keep coming back to, whether it's a referral plan, whether it's an automation strategy, whether it's the finances, whether it's, designing a great life, like, all of it comes back to setting some sort of goal or roadmap or plan, but walking it and then seeing what gets in your way. Like, that's what life is, I think, and enjoying the journey as much as you can while it happens.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so next week we've got Dan Schnurbusch coming on. We're going to talk about how to automate your best life. A little bit different run because we actually filmed Dan's episode before this. So I can tell you it was a great chat. It was really cool to see the breakdown of what firms benefit more from automation, what situations it's beneficial for AI, some of the tools currently in place, what the future looks like, and then ultimately like how to use those things to get time back to live a great life. So I know you all will enjoy that, but I'm not going to let Terrell go yet because I want to know, one, for anybody listening who's smart enough to know they want to hear more from you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I would say if you can find me on LinkedIn or Facebook, it is Terrell A. Turner, CPA. Or you can go to our website, tlturnergroup.com. And there you'll see a ton of great things that we share. We create a lot of videos and podcasts that you'll find on our website.
Awesome. And with that being said, what's your biggest piece of advice, your biggest tip for people? It can be related to finances or not, but when it comes to owning a business you can be proud of and living a life that's even better, what's the one thing to help more people do that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would say is come up with a plan. And I think when you are operating based on executing a plan that you are actually aware of, as opposed to just going with the flow, like you're going to give yourself a higher chance of success. I mean, because studies even show that is that you're more likely to be successful if you actually have a plan that you're aiming for. And then also, I think you're going to allow yourself to quiet, the doubts that pop in your head. Because if you know that you're walking through a plan, you don't have to go through the doubts of, is this the right thing? Or should we be doing this? Should we be doing this? But like, if you have a plan, I always look at it like if you're cooking with a recipe, if you have the recipe in front of you and you're following the recipe, it's a lot less stressful than trying to just remember it off the top of your head. So I always tell people in business and life is invest the time to come up with a plan. And you may realize that that plan doesn't work as your life changes. You can always adjust and, change out the plan and upgrade different factors, but I think it is best to have at least some type of roadmap that you're trying to follow because it's going to give you more peace, it's going to give you more clarity, and it's going to drastically increase your chances of being successful.
I love it. All right. Thank you, Terrell. Thank you to everybody who watched and listened. We'll see you back here next week with Dan Schnurbusch to talk about automating your best life. Until then, create that surplus, start putting it towards the right things, and ultimately give yourself the opportunity